Morenu Harav Dov ben Mordechai V'Tzipora. Rabbi Dov Marmer served this congregation with distinction from 1983 to 2000. Rabbi means teacher. Rabbi Marmer was good at all the roles a rabbi plays: pastor, counselor, social justice seeker, community builder and organizer, boss and mentor. But of all the roles a rabbi must play, the one that Rabbi Marmer delighted in the most was rabbi as teacher. He taught text, and he taught ideas, and he taught us how to live. He took the biggest and deepest ideas Judaism addresses, and he packaged them in such a way that the rest of us could access them. And then, one step further, he would challenge us to consider those ideas for ourselves. Tonight we have an opportunity to learn from some of Rabbi Marmer's teachings through the voices of his students and his friends. 5 rabbis from England, Israel, and Toronto, and 5 lay leaders from Holy Blossom Temple, all of whom were influenced by him, shaped by him, and encouraged by him. So first, we will learn from Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Maganet, who is a leading figure of British Jewry. He has a medical degree, rabbinic ordination from Leo Baeck College, and a PhD in biblical studies. For over 40 years, he was professor of and eventually principal of Leo Baeck College, where Rabbi Marmer was among the first ordinees. Rabbi Maganet is co-editor of the prayer books of England's Movement for Reform Judaism. He is vice president of the World Union for Progressive Judaism and longtime editor of the academic journal called European Judaism, which will soon include a lengthy section in memoriam to honor Rabbi Marmer's many contributions to world Jewry.
When I was invited to read something by Dov, I came across an essay by him published in January 2004 in Manna, the journal of the Sternberg Center for Judaism in London. It is a tribute to Professor Emil Fackenheim. As an example of Dov's writing, it feels particularly fitting because of Fackenheim's association with Holy Blossom. Dov gives a brief history of Fackenheim. Born in 1916 in Germany, his rabbinic studies at the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums in Berlin were interrupted after Kristallnacht, when he spent a few months in a Sachsenhausen concentration camp. On release, he was ordained in haste, left for Scotland, only to be deported to Canada from Britain during the war as an enemy alien. Dov continues. When Fackenheim was released from the Canadian internment camp, he became the rabbi of the Reformed Temple in Hamilton, Ontario. While serving the congregation, he completed his academic studies, and for some 4 decades was professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto. Upon his retirement in 1984, he and his family went to live in Jerusalem, where he died in 2003. While teaching at the University of Toronto, he was also connected to the Holy Blossom Temple. There he taught the confirmation class for many years and gave lectures, especially around the High Holy Days. His first book, Paths to Jewish Belief, in 1960, was based on his confirmation courses. Dov continues. Moving to Israel was an act of enormous courage, for no philosopher should ever live according to his teachings. Fackenheim tried to disprove the rule and remained committed to the Jewish state until his dying day, even though Israel was not particularly committed to him. Perhaps the main reason why Fackenheim was not recognized in Israel was that theology, including Holocaust theology, has never been in the center of Jewish intellectual life in general, and Israeli intellectual life in particular. His message had become important for diaspora Jewry in the
and is
decades
ready to
after
lecture life
the
in particular.
1967 Six-Day
His
War,
message had become
when Jewish
important for
survival
diaspora
and
Jewry
Jewish
in the
continuity
decades
in the
after
midst of the
the
dangers from
1967
without
Six-Day War,
and the attraction and
when Jewish
opportunities of
survival
assimilation
and
were on
Jewish
the agenda
continuity
for
in the
virtually
midst of the
every Jewish
dangers from
community
without
outside Israel.
and the attraction and
But the issue
opportunities of
was never equally
assimilation
significant
were on the
in the
agenda
Jewish
for
state,
virtually every
even though
Jewish
its Jewish
community
citizens
outside of
faced many
Israel.
more dangers than
But
their
the issue
sisters
was
and
never
brothers
equally
in the
significant
diaspora.
in the Jewish state,
The challenge
even though its
and
Jewish
the way Israel
citizens
was perceived
faced
by
many more
Fackenheim
dangers than
seemed
their
for many
sisters and
Israelis
brothers in
to
the
be
diaspora.
primarily a
The
diaspora
challenge
phenomenon,
and the way
a
Israel was
mixture of an
perceived by
exaggerated
Fackenheim
fear of
seemed for
anti-Semitism
many
and a
Israelis to
somewhat
be primarily a diaspora phenomenon, a mixture of an exaggerated fear of anti-Semitism and a somewhat romantic view of Zionism. When Fackenheim embarked on his academic career more than 6 decades ago, Jews in the diaspora were not yet able to reflect on the Holocaust, though many lived in its shadow. In the two decades that followed, when historic analyses and personal memoirs of the tragedy began to appear in print, those equipped to formulate religious responses were still not ready to speak. The first period of post-Holocaust Jewish writing was a plea for silence. Paradoxically, survivors and others wrote in order when around the time of Israel's Six-Day War, the theological journal Judaism published a transcript of a symposium it had sponsored a few months earlier about Jewish values after the Holocaust. Participants included a relatively unknown professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto. Fackenheim's contribution catapulted him to international fame. Dov wrote, "It made a lasting impression on me and many of my generation, for it is in that symposium that he first formulated his so-called 614th commandment. The message was simple. Jews must survive in order not to give Hitler a posthumous victory." Dov now quotes from that article. "If the 614th commandment is binding upon the authentic Jew, then we are, first, commanded to survive as Jews, lest the Jewish people perish. We are commanded, second, to remember in our very guts and bones the martyrs of the Holocaust, lest their memory perish. We are forbidden, thirdly, to deny or despair of God, however much we may contend with him, lest Judaism perish. We are forbidden, finally, to despair of the world as a place which is to become the kingdom of God, lest we help make it a meaningless place in which God is dead or irrelevant, and everything is permitted." End of quote. For me personally, Dov continues, Fackenheim became something of an absentee mentor. From then on, I have tried to read everything he wrote and was particularly influenced by his collection of essays, Quest for Past and Future, 1968. That book helped to give a content to my life as a Reformed Jew that went far beyond the institutional framework of what then was known as the Reformed synagogues of Great Britain. In 1982, I published a book which, despite the deep influence that Ignaz Maybaum had had on me, and the debt I owed to Emil Fackenheim, was something of a critique of the understanding of the Shoah as the justification of Jewish life. It stated my reservations, Dov writes, with a measure of chutzpah, and he quotes himself, Fackenheim's dictum and the program of action, which reflected the primacy and the commandment to survive, may have been appropriate for the first and perhaps second decade after the Holocaust. but it can never be more than an interim formula. He goes on, my objections to Fackenheim's thesis were simplistic and mundane, and I continued to learn from him even when I found more than he was offering, even though I wanted more than he was offering. One reason for wanting more was because though his commandment to survive and to remember was vitally important to me personally, I knew that it didn't have much of an impact on the Jews to whom I was ministering, particularly the young. For members of the congregation I served, and indeed for its sister congregations, survival of the Jewish people was not a matter of how, be it through Orthodox observance, Zionist aliyah, or in some other way, but why. They wanted to know the purpose of being Jewish, now when Jews had the opportunity of full integration into British society. And that neither Fackenheim nor the other Holocaust theologians could answer. Hence my quest for Judaism that would look beyond survival. It may be possible to formulate a post-Holocaust Jewish theology that goes back to the tradition that affirms God as the ineffable, who defies human speculation, and whose attributes, as Maimonides would have it, can only be expressed negatively, telling us who and what God is not. That which can be stated in the affirmative is how Jews must act to assure survival, engage in study, prayer, and observance, and in many other ways seek to express our commitment far beyond halakha and custom. And no group is potentially better suited to explore both old and new paths than the kind of Judaism that we find in the liberal and in the ostensibly secular movements around the world, not least in Israel. Dov concludes, Fackenheim helped us to see Judaism in a different light. Whether he intended it or not, his was post-halachic, perhaps even post-theological Judaism. It is for us, and those who will come after us, to take it from there, if for no other reason than to assure our survival not as a relic, but as a living faith that flourishes as it continues to defy Hitler, his posthumous victory. Thank you for allowing me to contribute to this evening in memory of Rabbi Dov Marmor, Zichrono Livracha.
Dov Marmor changed my life. Good evening. My name is Cynthia Good, and I've been a member of Holy Blossom Temple for over 30 years. Let me tell you about how it all began. I came from a secular family. We were cultural Jews, but non-practicing, and certainly non-shul going. But when I was nearing 40, I felt a yearning to study Judaism, but I didn't know how to go about it. I was in the publishing business, and at a launch party for a book by Michael Maris, I saw Rabbi Plaut, who I knew a little. I told him my dilemma, and he led me across the room and introduced me to Rabbi Marmor. Even then, I felt that something momentous was happening. In a few days, Rabbi Marmor took me out for lunch and asked me, "Are you an intellectual Jew or a touchy-feely Jew?" I responded that in the company of intellectuals, I would temper it with feeling, and in the company of those who might veer towards the mystical or the overly soft, I would be the intellectual. Dov said that if I wanted to study with him, it would be an intellectual approach, and I agreed that that was the way to learn something. he invited me to Torah study the following Saturday at 9 a.m. But I was a hardworking publisher, and Saturday morning meant sleeping in to me, so I nodded politely, but I really had no intention of attending. But on Friday morning at work, I received a phone call from Rabbi Marmer. Would he see me the next day? Well, to my surprise, and I'm sure to his, I burst out crying. I don't know how to do this, I said. I don't know how to be in a synagogue. I'm embarrassed. I don't even know what door to go into. Then came the words that would change everything for me. I'll meet you in the parking lot, said Rabbi Marmer. And he did. That first Torah study was incredible. By lucky chance, the rabbi was leading our study of the Song of Solomon. As a lover of literature, I was amazed by the gorgeous poetry. I was surprised by the eroticism and the fact that a rabbi would be talking about that, and intrigued by the theology. I came back again the next week and the next. Torah study continued to be a revelation for me. From the beginning, I was addicted to learning, and both the rabbi and I enjoyed those times when I offered an emotional rather than intellectual response to the text. Rabbi Marmer gave me a book list, and I read every book and then discussed it with him. When I said on that first day that I'd like to attend service, he said I didn't have to take it slow, but I did enter the sanctuary. Brought to tears by Cantor Meisner's singing, invigorated by Rabbi Marmer's sermon, from that day to this, Holy Blossom has been my home, my treasured community. I would not be the person I am today without Dov Marmer. Through Rabbi Marmer's teaching, my intellect expanded, my values followed Jewish paths. I hope and believe that I became a better person at work and in my personal life. Because he brought me to Holy Blossom, I made dear friends. I learned some Hebrew, and at age 43 became a bat mitzvah. I continued to chant Torah. And something else. When I joined the congregation, I was a single woman, and this saddened Dov. He told me that he would be lost without his Freja, his center. He wished nothing more than for me to meet someone. And when I did, and I believe that Dov prepared me for that relationship, and I introduced Dan to him, Dov embraced him, literally and figuratively, and they spent happy times together, speaking in Polish and drinking vodka. So how will I remember Rabbi Marmer? As I first experienced him leading Torah study, reading the Hebrew, translating, then analyzing with brilliant insight, deep learning, relevance, and reverence. And at home with Freja, as a host of capacious generosity, delighting in his wife and entertaining his guests. And finally, at our chuppah, marrying me and Dan, with great solemnity and even more joy reflected in his face. This is how I will remember Dov Marmer, my rabbi, my friend.
Thank you, Cynthia. We have Rabbi Marmer to thank for your leadership and the good books that you bring to Holy Blossom.
Rabbi John Moskowitz needs no introduction. Holy Blossom Temple's Rabbi Emeritus now. Rabbi Moskowitz first came to Toronto in 1987 when Rabbi Marmer invited him to be the associate rabbi. They both like to often tell the story of how a mutual friend called each one and said, "There's someone I'd like you to meet. You're not such an easy fit, and neither is he." Rabbi Moskowitz served the congregation for 25 years, including 12 as our senior rabbi.
What I wish to say about Dov Marmor is perhaps less about a specific text and more about the man himself, because how he was in the world, how he was as a rabbi, every day and in every way, really was the text. You know the famous story about the young acolyte in the Talmud who hides under the bed of his master. Why? So that in the morning when the master gets up and puts on his shoes, the young acolyte wants to know, how did he tie the shoes? Well, we all watched Dov closely, not just his colleagues, but all of us, I think, because there was an enormous amount to learn from the man, because he really had, if you think about it, an extraordinary life. So let me say the following in that spirit, and permit me to read it, because I haven't figured out this technological stuff yet. And by the way, Dov did neither. Maybe he did by the end of his life, but I doubt it, because he was as confused often as I was, and we would talk about it and laugh about it, because that's what it was. Anyway, here's what I'd wish to say about Dov. The young Dov Marmor emerged from the ravages of mid-century Europe, just 10 years old when the war ended, and already on his way to becoming largely a self-constructed man, and one who bore, both on his face and within his soul, the tragedies and the triumphs of the Jews of the 20th century. For even at the beginning, even while within the clutches of the Soviets, and then certainly after that in Sweden, Dov was amongst those determined to put back the broken pieces, both personal and communal. And he would do so on 3 continents, as we know, and invariably with substance and clarity of purpose. That was Dov. No surprise, then, that soon enough he would earn a place amongst the generation's leading rabbis. This well-constructed life, because once having escaped the whirlwind, Dov Marmor was hardly about survival alone. Beyond survival was his consciously chosen path, a worldview, in fact, decades before it was an early book title. How did Dov construct this unique life, and how exactly did he put his imprint on a post-Holocaust Jewish world? Permit the suggestion of 3 primary factors. His drive, relentless but measured, a drive possibly born of being a child catapulted into the abyss and subsequently intent on making meaning of the chaos. Second, his orderly and probing mind, one honed by books and teachers and reflection. And perhaps most of all, the love of a beautiful young woman, one Fredje Zonnebend, whose devotion made a refugee almost at home in the world, a world eventually made more whole by Fredje and Dov's children and grandchildren. So it's not an oversimplification to suggest that Dov's biography was his Torah. Yes, he taught philosophy and theology in a Jewish key, and to be sure, Dov learned and knew the sources and invariably employed them with panache. But I think he was a reader and a thinker before he was a darshan. Regardless, the Torah of Dov Marmor was written black on white and within the spaces of a world gone mad, now to be corrected, at least in part, by Dov's highly ordered mind and learning. And after all, this was a serious man, no phony put-on cheery stuff for him. For unlike many rabbinic colleagues, Dov refused to smile when that wasn't called for. He wasn't, as he was wont to remind us, an American. So upon my own arrival in Toronto in the late 80s, when one day someone criticized me for my lack of smiling from the bima, saying, "My God, you remind me of Marmor," nothing brought a bigger smile to my face, and to his too, when I relayed the story to Dov. I've said 3 factors made a young Polish Jewish refugee into a loving husband and father, grandfather too, and an effective rabbi. But there really was a 4th matter, maybe the most important one, and one that Dove held paramount, but didn't necessarily speak about all that much, though he was daily familiar with its ironies and unpredictable nature. He wrote, almost in passing in his memoir, that it was divine providence, unpredictable, unfathomable, but real, that brought Dove's survival and that of his parents. And thus was born, or perhaps was made, a believing Jew, and one who would live that faith without ever showing it off. It's also no secret that Dove Marmer wasn't always so easy. He could be quite critical, including of his colleagues. But it's also the case that his colleagues, and I guess most everyone else, esteemed him so that we sought his approval and shrunk some when that wasn't forthcoming. Consider that the first couple of times that I read Torah in his presence, 87, fall of 87, let's just say that I made a couple of mistakes. Let's say it was more than a couple. After the second time, Dove was not happy. And he made his unhappiness clear to me, saying in part, maybe I'll do that from now on. You're not so good at it. But that wasn't going to happen. Assigning Torah readings beyond the B'nai Mitzvah was my job. And from then on, I would take the opportunity to get it right. And along the way, perhaps show the boss wrong. So I kept assigning Torah readings to myself. 3 years or so go by, several dozen Torah readings, nary a mistake. Neither one of us said a word about it in those 3 or 4 years, until one Shabbat morning, I got a word wrong. Once the Torah service was done, unhappy with myself, I'm now seated next to Dove back at the back of the bima there at Holy Blossom. And after a moment, I lean over to him and I say, the word was tsuveti, wasn't it? Dove smiled and said, it was, but I must say you do that awfully well. You see, as much as anything else, Dove Marmer was about redemption, and not just theological, but personal redemption. Generous man that he was, Dove thrilled to the success of others, from his colleagues and congregants to his friends and family. For in the end, as in the beginning, Dove Marmer was a living reminder, and I think that was really his text. That was his Torah, a living reminder of God's salvific, if mysterious ways. Dove Marmer's death does not obscure this truth from us. It actually reinforces what our teacher was all about. The book of Judges teaches that especially those who've known affliction, as Judges says, those who love God are like the sun rising in power. Dove Marmer's sun rose in power brilliantly for near 9 decades, and we can have faith that its light will not soon wane. Because after all, that is the meaning, also, mysterious, real, potent as it is, of beyond survival.
You'll note that my basketball playing days have ended. The golden years have come at last, and the end of that poem can be recited by my dear wife. Good evening. Rabbi Splansky asked me to say a few personal words about my old friend, I can't say colleague, but friend, Dove Marmer. My name is Marvin Tile, and I'm an orthopedic surgeon, an emeritus professor at the University of Toronto, and a member of the temple for some 70 years, and that's a story in its own. I've known the Marmers since their arrival in Toronto in 1983, first as a rabbi and scholar, and then as a close personal friend. And it's on that basis that I've been asked to speak tonight. Likely that friendship grew as I soon learned that we shared being Jewish men in the Deutsche Schule. And that was really something. We were Polish in the German Schule. And at one point I told them a very nice story. I had a patient who was an original member of the Schule, and a very well-known family. And she came to my office with her mother, who went back to Bond Street. And they were German Jews to the core. And the mother was sitting there, and she said, "I understand you belong to the Holy Blossom Temple." And I said, "Yes, I do. We love it there." And she said, "I understand that there are some Polish people there now." And I said, "Yes, there are a few, including the head rabbi." And she was quite content with it and went on for a while. But that story he enjoyed very, very much. Also, the friendship grew as soon as we learned not only that we were Polish Jews in the Deutsche Schule, but in my professional life, I had spent a great deal of time in Dove's hometown of Göteborg, Sweden. I was the head of a spine society, which was out of there, a world organization. In some of our visits, we visited with his mother, and so that connection was also a very interesting one. We shared time together over the years with friends at the Shaw Festival, at Stratford, here in Toronto, and much private time together. And I'd like to share a few thoughts about the private time to begin with. In my younger years, you might say that I was the ultimate jock. I was never without a basketball, a volleyball, a football, or a hockey stick. And also, in my later years, I enjoyed the great outdoors on my sailboat, with a golf club, and skiing above all. Now, those of you who knew Dove Marmer would say he not only did not love any of these activities of sport and the great outdoor, I don't want to use the word disdain, but maybe outwardly, he would tell me over and over, and all his friends knew that this was not the Dove Marmer who, when he was walking down the street in Göteborg, and this is what drove him into London, England in the first place, he met a high school teacher. Most of you know this story, and the high school teacher said, Dove said, "Oh, Mr. So-and-so, Mr. Johansson, you taught me. Do you remember?" And he looked at Dove and he said, "Yes, Jewish, fat." And that was how he was greeted by a school teacher in Sweden. So disdaining sport and the great outdoors was his persona. Well, how did we get to be friends? I mean, we were really very close friends for many, many years. So during his many trips to the Island Yacht Club, and he loved coming to the yacht club in his blazer and getting on the tender, the Doc Walensky. He thought that was very, very funny. And he ended up on the yacht. But then he began to relax, and he went out sailing. And one day he actually showed up without a tie. And I have a photograph of that in my collection. I think I showed it at his retirement when I spoke as well. There was Dove sailing on Lake Ontario, his hair blowing in the wind and loving every minute without a tie. His many visits to our chalet in Collingwood were priceless. He loved sitting on the porch in the evening with a vodka or scotch in hand and looking at the blazing sunset with a t-shirt. I wouldn't say jeans, but with not formal pants, and Fredja by his side. And tonight, I actually looked at that photograph just to remind me what it was like with the four of us on the porch and the blazing sunset in the back. Also, my most memorable remembrance is going with Dove and Fredja to the Thornbury Harbor in Collingwood, where we eventually took our boat. He loved hiking and walking and sailing in Georgian Bay. No one who knew him would even believe that that could happen, but there it was. And I have another memorable photograph, which I also looked at tonight, with Dove and Fredja on the Georgian Trail, hand in hand in the evening, walking away from me. It's just a wonderful, wonderful photo. Food and wine was another interesting thing. No great love for food or wine, said Dove. But when we said, let's go out for dinner, he said, where's the best Indian restaurant? Well, down the steps at Yorkville, just right near Bay Street, there was one of the great Indian restaurants. And when we walked down those steps, they greeted Dove Marmer like the Maharaja. I mean, he was there. And of course, I got a menu, and I knew nothing about Indian food. And he said, don't worry, Marvin, I will order everything for you. So that's where I learned about tikka and tandoori, and especially buttered chicken. That was really something. The very last visit there is a story about Fredja. When we finished dinner, we walked out to the restaurant, and Fredja collapsed in my arms. And I laid her down on Yorkville Avenue, and an Indian lady walked by, a young lady, and she said, hi, Dr. Tile. I'm the new internist cardiologist at Sunnybrook. Can I help you? And Dove turned to me and said, no, it can't be. You can't know the whole world. This is not possible. And we laid her down. We were worried about really something very serious, but we soon thought it was a fainting spell, and she began to wake up. The big fire truck came from Yorkville and offered to take Fredja home, and Fredja said, no, thank you, I will walk. Now, if that isn't Fredja at her best, I don't know what to say. It was incredible. The final thing I'd like to talk about is Dove Marmer's attitude with the Holocaust and his lecturing at St. Regis College. When I was playing basketball for the YMHA, we went to St. Jerome's College, a Jesuit college, and we had the worst anti-Semitic yelling at us by the priests that I have ever encountered in my years, and there's a little bit of a talk at the university about this coming up in about a week's time, which I'm involved with. So I said to Dove, I hear you're going to be lecturing at St. Regis College and St. Michael's. He said, yes. And I told him this story. He said, well, don't worry about that. We can change minds. So I was delighted to be present when he was given an honorary fellowship to St. Regis Jesuit College. I was one of the few people from the temple in the audience. I knew some of the organizers. And afterwards, we went along to the college, and the head of the college, the priest, had lined the walls of the college with Holocaust memorial symbols, Auschwitz and everything were along there. So indeed, Dove had changed many minds, and for that, I am grateful. I love Dove Marmer, we love Fredja, we've been friends, and I'm grateful to be able to bring you some of these little vignettes about his personal life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tile, for sharing those more personal insights into Rabbi Marmer. And it is so easy to admire the friendship that you and Esther have enjoyed with Dov and Fredja for all these years, even transcending the distance from here to Jerusalem every week with your phone calls. Our next teaching is about Rabbi Marmer's Zionism. Rabbi Tony Bayfield was the congregational rabbi for Northwest Surrey Synagogue for 10 years. Then he became the director of the Sternberg Center for Judaism. He was head of Great Britain's movement for Reform Judaism from 1994 until 2016. Rabbi Bayfield is a specialist in modern Jewish thought, Christian-Jewish reconciliation, and Jewish-Muslim dialogue. And you'll hear hints of his humor, and you'll recognize it as something that he shared with Rabbi Marmer.
Good Elul evening to all of you. My name is Rabbi Tony Bayfield, and it's a real honor and privilege to participate in this teaching tribute from London, England, not London, Ontario, but then you can tell it's London, England from my cute British accent. Dov Marmer, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, was my teacher and rabbinic father for more than 60 years. He influenced almost every aspect of my life and career, even inviting me to Holy Blossom as scholar in residence and accompanying me on an audience with the late Gunter Plaut, whom I'd previously thought was a chumash. I remember vividly the sign delineating Dov's parking space, which read, "Reserved for Rabbi Marmer, day and night." That explains how he was able to carry out all the many duties of a senior rabbi, whilst at the same time writing and publishing in 1991 a theologically defining book, The Star of Return. The title, for the benefit of the person sitting next to you, was an allusion to the famous early 20th century German Jewish philosopher and teacher Franz Rosenzweig, and to his book, The Star of Redemption. Considerably harder to read than Dov's, but then Rosenzweig's star made Marcel Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu seem like a child's first reader. Like Dov, two complex but astonishingly important Jews, and I make no apology for including Dov with the other two. As so often with Dov, the nod through the similarity of title wasn't simply a matter of respect, but rather one of respectful disagreement, particularly with Rosenzweig's unbridled universalism. Rosenzweig's experiences in the trenches, on the Balkan front in the First World War, were life and thought changing, but Dov's considerably more traumatic experiences as a child from 1939 to 1948 led them in very different directions. In Dov's case, it didn't lead to a distant hope of universal redemption, but to the far more immediate imperative of return. As those of you who've also read Dov's autobiography, Six Lives, will know, the journey starts with his parents, Max and Zipporah, and his first 4 years in Galicia, not the Spanish one. Dov and flamenco dancing is inconceivable, but Galicia, the remotest, the poorest province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and a small town called Jaslo, not far from a much larger city, which sadly we hear too much about today, Lvov, now Lviv. As Dov wrote, on September the 1st, 1939, my world collapsed. I mark the date every year as the anniversary of my anxiety neurosis. It was the day Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and my mother and I, together with a few others, were taken to the eastern part of the country. I recall no details of the journey other than it was horrendous. The cart that the horses were pulling was full of people and household items. At some point, a jar of jam broke and landed on me. It was very sticky and most uncomfortable. I can't bear sticky things to this day. That journey marks a rupture and a dramatic end to my childhood. I still long for it. To understand Dov and his most un-British, even most un-Canadian forthrightness, you have to understand that rupture and Dov's longing. His parents were Verbrennte Zionists, members of a left-wing Zionist party, Po'alei Zion. It was the glue, wrote Dov, that brought his parents together and held them together, rather than the love and affinity we would more readily recognize. But their affinity was wholly decisive. Our teacher was born into Zionism, worked as a young man in Sweden with the Israel legation, and, as your rabbi, wrote the most important book of Reform Zionist theology ever written, Parche Wilherberg. He called it the Star of Return because the arc of his life led him increasingly back to Zion and back to Jerusalem, where, as we all know and lament, he died only weeks ago. He begins his star, the Star of Return, by taking on another revered figure, this time Abraham Joshua Heschel, and Heschel's Architecture of Time. Judaism, Heschel had argued in his book, The Sabbath, is a religion not in space and the material things that fill it, but wholly in time. The Sabbaths are our great cathedrals, wrote Heschel. Dov had no truck with this whatsoever, insisting that Judaism is anything but ethereal and ungrounded. He redressed both the universalist locational balance with characteristic Marmorian firmness and clarity. Here's a passage that, if you don't know it, you may wish to reflect on in the coming days and ask what it says to you. Jewish geography is no less significant than Jewish history. There is Jewish space and Jewish place, not just Jewish time. Jewish aspirations are not only about the world beyond, but are also about an address on this earth. The heavenly Jerusalem and the earthly Jerusalem are contingent on each other. You'll recognize the rabbinic phrases Yerushalayim shel Ma'ala, the heavenly Jerusalem, and Yerushalayim shel Lamata, the earthly Jerusalem. And you may wish to think more about how they're contingent upon each other. You may want to go back to the book and read that passage in context. Dov's balancing particularism was, however, far from absolute. He never had a problem with the meaning and the purpose and the validity of diaspora. You know better than any community, since he and Fredja lived for many happy years, spending half their time in Toronto and half their time in Jerusalem. But the son of Zionist parents, who survived miraculously as he did, was always determined to return to Zion. And equally symbolically and physically contingent, he has grandchildren in Israel and grandchildren in London, where his 50 years of extraordinary congregational service began.
Good evening. I am honored on behalf of my husband David Baskin and I to speak about our friend and Rabbi Marmer tonight. Our stories are not about his speaking from the bima, his leadership of our entire institution, but instead our relationship with him was most powerful in his personal responses to our life questions. First, a story from David. When our son Jacob was 3 years old, we really wanted him to go to the Holy Blossom Nursery School, but it was full. So David went to Rabbi Marmer and he said, "Rabbi, at a time when Israel is taking in hundreds of thousands of Russian Jews, do you mean to say that we can't find room for one 4-year-old at Holy Blossom Temple?" Rabbi Marmer, of course, arranged for another class to be opened, but he also said to David, "I see a new temple board member." Second story. When our children were little, we had a gerbil, which cost $10 until the gerbil broke its leg. And after the gerbil broke its leg, we were spending hundreds and then thousands of dollars on trying to repair the gerbil's leg. So we asked Rabbi Marmer, are we obliged to continue to try to repair the gerbil? And he said, Jewish tradition does not support having pets. It isn't suggesting that we should have a pet, but it says that once you do, you must take good care of it. And so we continued to try to repair the gerbil's leg. It turns out unsuccessfully. Third, we were puzzled by what to do about the beggars on the streets of Toronto, and we didn't believe that paying an individual beggar $2 would make a difference to that beggar's life. So we asked Rabbi Marmer what to do. He said, "You must give money to the beggar, not because it would be the best way to address the beggar's larger life issues, but because it shames a man to beg, and you need to take steps to reduce his shame by giving him money. And so we did. And then, as president of Holy Blossom Temple, and in difficult times before I was the president, I turned to Rabbi Marmer. And instead of giving me advice on individual issues, he would say, "Joan, the board always gets it right. The board may act slowly, but in the end, the board gets it right." My most enduring memories of Dov and Fredya are not listening to Rabbi Marmer at Holy Blossom Temple, but sitting with Dov and Fredya in their 2 living rooms in Israel, most recently on Derech Beit Lechem, eating a lovely nosh provided by Fredya, and leaning in to talk about Holy Blossom Temple. He loved to talk about Temple. I would turn to them with issues, and I would receive wise counsel, not only from Dov, but also from Fredya, with great insight from time to time. Dov would be gleeful about Holy Blossom Temple, and he frequently knew more than I did. While he adored his family, loved living in Israel, could tell great stories about every single grandchild, his role with me was to gossip, and it was delightful. He has great pride in the steps he took to support Temple. He followed everybody, and I can't believe that we won't be there together next time I'm in Israel to talk about Temple. Rabbi Marmer, we will all miss you.
Straight from her ordination in 1983. She returned to Toronto after a short stay in the US to found Kollel, an adult center for liberal Jewish learning, and eventually to lead City Shul. Rabbi Goldstein writes widely on Jewish feminism and also volunteers as rabbi to Adat Yisrael, a small congregation in Guatemala City.
Shana Tova to everyone. A few years after I served Holy Blossom, I was in my own solo congregation in Boston. It was Erev Rosh Hashanah, and I walked into the sanctuary to see a middle-aged man in a talit on Erev Rosh Hashanah. Now I knew that the only night of the year that we wear a talit is Erev Yom Kippur. And I knew that it's highly untraditional to wear a talit at an evening service. And I was struck with a moment of what to do. This is one of those moments that I said to myself, what would Dov do? And I was ambivalent whether to tell him that perhaps he was thinking of Erev Yom Kippur. Do I tell him it's not a tradition to wear a talit in the evening? Or do I just let him wear the talit because it's meaningful to him? At that moment, it encapsulated for me all of my working and all of my yearning in the Reform movement for a kind of knowledge level that would mean that I would not be put in the position as the rabbi of telling someone what they're doing is not what the communal standard is. And I did end up speaking to the person, and he said to me, and I quote, "I always wear a talit when I come to synagogue." Well, if the only time he came to synagogue was Erev Rosh Hashanah, then he was going to wear his talit. And I remember calling Dov because we used to speak very often, especially after the high holidays in my congregation in Boston, and telling him the story. And what he said resonated with me so deeply, and through the years I have really mused on it and kept it as a sort of a signal for myself. He said, we have to be careful that we're not raising a generation of pious ignoramuses. Now that phrase, pious ignoramus, was one of Dove's favorite phrases. And he and I often would talk about how can we in the Reform movement be sure that we aren't creating a congregation of pious ignoramuses. Because in those days, in the 80s, we were in the middle of a sort of a revolution in the Reform movement of taking on much more tradition. When I came to Holy Blossom in 1983, there were no kippot or talesim in the sanctuary. If you wanted, or a guest of yours wanted, to wear a kippah or a talit and hadn't brought one themselves, they had to go to the head usher and ask if they could possibly have a kippah or a talit, and those were kept in a box off to the side of the main sanctuary, and the head usher would go and get them one. And I remember talking to Dove about this on-taking of so many more new rituals, traditional rituals in a new way in the Reform movement. And again, he said to me, let's not create pious ignoramuses. But in 1984, he and I together changed that tradition at Holy Blossom and brought the kippot and talesim into the sanctuary for those who would want them. His insistence that if we're going to take on traditional rubrics, if we're going to take on more Hebrew, if we're going to take on a more traditional service, we do so from the depth of knowledge. That, he said, was the crux of why he was a Reformed Jew. Because every ritual, every occurrence, every event had to be done from a place of research, understanding, and familiarity with the tradition behind what we were doing. So in keeping with Dove's insistence that if we're going to have piety, it's going to have to be knowledgeable piety. I'm going to ask you a provocative question about this at the end. I want to quote 3 different places from Dove's book On Being a Jew, a Reform Perspective, which underscores his insistence on piety within knowledge. Now, the other part of his piety within knowledge insistence is that he also insisted that we do all of our traditional rubrics, or we look at adding all these traditions into Reform Judaism, not only from a point of knowledge, but from a point of communal standard. Dove was very strong on expecting there to be a communal standard. You didn't have to do it at home, but you had to do it in synagogue. Why? Because the community required this kind of communal standard. He always spoke against everybody making Shabbos for themselves. So there's 3 places I want to read from On Being a Jew that shows his insistence on the communal over the individual in 3 different ways. So the first thing I want to read is from page 43, and it is his insistence on communal piety as a prerequisite for individual piety, because normally, or I'll say in the traditional community, individual piety comes first. And here is what he says. In our context, this means that we do not relate to tradition in search of authenticity, but choose bits and pieces that take our fancy. Current practices among Reform Jews, for example, reveal an unbelievable hodgepodge. Our attitude to the Gentile world is equally strange. We imitate when we should desist, and desist when cooperation is called for. When it comes to teaching our children, our idiosyncrasies border on the bizarre. And when it comes to our own lives, the vestiges and fragments of Judaism that are included often lack coherence. That is how we must understand recent efforts to place religious commitment and religious living in the center of Reform Judaism. They reflect the determination of our leadership to counteract the tepid civil religion into which many of us have fled. They shy away from reducing us to nameless and faceless donors to Jewish causes, who pay lip service to tradition, to the Gentile world, and to their children's Jewish commitment as manifestations of civil religion. The leadership of our movement has called us to step forward as individuals and seek to make Judaism relevant to our own lives. We are called upon not only to vote in committees, but to testify at services. Not only to choose, but to discipline ourselves, to subject ourselves voluntarily to the obligations that mitzvot make on us. Reform Judaism needs no legal code, only responsible adherents who impose duties on themselves. I want to read that last sentence and hone in on this point in which Dov was afraid to make pious ignoramuses. Reform Judaism needs no legal code, only responsible adherents who impose duties on themselves. And this way, Dov expected that because we are voting to be part of a community, we will impose upon ourselves taking on mitzvot. Those mitzvot included being part of a minyan, especially for the saying of Kaddish. Those mitzvot included taking Shabbat seriously, and also the way we dress for services and the way we eat. The second place that Dov insisted on the communal and the responsibility of the individual towards the communal was in standards of the community, especially around rabbis. So I'm reading from page 59. It may also be possible to satisfy the demands of all, or most, lines of demarcation simultaneously by making the halachic distinction between Reshut HaYachid, private practice, and Reshut HaRabim, public policy. We can probably meet the needs of our members by not castigating them for lax Shabbat observance in their homes, and yet maintain a standard of observance in our congregations that is traditional and consistent with practice in the community. We can do so without making public pronouncements about how we intend to change the criteria for Jewishness or disregard traditional notions of the conduct of rabbis. He said this in the context of patrilineal descent and in not changing the traditional definition of who is a Jew, but he also said it in terms of Shabbat observance. And last, he required of us that we think about halachic seriousness. And in this, I'm reading from page 53. We live in a postmodern world. Modernity caused secularization and distance from conventional religion. The postmodern era has made us realize that God is not dead, although many religious institutions are gasping for breath, but that God is present in everything we do that has meaning. And that most certainly includes the practice of law. And by this he meant halachic standards. So my question is, how will we avoid in the next generation creating pious ignoramuses? How will we take seriously his call to reflection and halachic mitzvah obligation of a Reform congregation and a Reform Jew? Back to my original story with the provocative question for you. Does it matter? Does it matter if we do things because we want to? We wear a talit for an evening service because that's what moves us, even though it's not the communal standard. Does it matter if we choose to take on mitzvot and take on religious rubrics without understanding them? Isn't it better for us to just take them on, na'aseh v'nishma, and then research them and then understand them? Would we have people not take on religious ritual if they didn't understand it and wait and hope that one day they will? Should we, as leaders of a community, say, these are our Reform standards, you should accept them, and you'll understand them later. Na'aseh v'nishma, we're going to do them now, and understand them later? How shall we understand Dov's insistence on communal acceptance of mitzvot, on communal acceptance of standards, and on communal acceptance of halachic seriousness? And with this, I wish you Shana Tova. May it be a season of beautiful reflection, and may Rabbi Marmer's memory be a blessing.
We have heard about Rabbi Marmer's post-Holocaust theology. We have heard about his Zionism. We have heard about his Reform Jewish practice. And from Elliot Jacobson, past president of Holy Blossom Temple, we're going to hear just a word about Rabbi Marmer's activism. So Elliot wanted very much to be with us in person tonight to share some personal remembrances of his rabbi and his friend. Elliot is resting at home now, but is with us through the live stream, and he has asked me to share these words of tribute on his behalf. What I learned from Dov Marmer. We met Rabbi Marmer in 1983 when he came to Holy Blossom. We had just joined and had been invited to be part of the new leadership group. So our introduction to Rabbi Marmer was in a small group setting. His warmth and intellect were obvious. Rabbi Marmer was in some ways an outsider, not raised or schooled in North America, and Holy Blossom was his first pulpit on this continent. He therefore did not think Holy Blossom should rest on its laurels or be afraid to take action in new ways. He recognized the importance of Holy Blossom as an exemplar of Reform values. This is the way we've always done things here, did not impress him. As somewhat of an outsider myself, Elliot says, I was born and raised in the Maritimes and came to Reform Judaism as an adult, so definitely without a Holy Blossom pedigree. We had something in common. During my tenure as president of this congregation, I am most proud of working side by side with Rabbi Marmer on two major initiatives. The third Seder for AIDS started in the 519 Community Center and soon outgrew the space there. It came in-house to Holy Blossom at a time when many people thought that AIDS was not a Jewish problem, and many people did not see the importance of such an initiative to the Jewish community. Also, the Out of the Cold program, which continues to this day, just before the pandemic, and we're going to reinitiate a new version of it soon this fall. This was also seen by many as a problem that existed elsewhere in the city. Rabbi Marmer reminded us all that Leviticus enjoins us to love our neighbor as ourselves, even when the neighbor is dressed shabbily and is unable to access a shower. Not everyone agreed with those two initiatives. Rabbi Marmer taught me that when someone complains about how a decision is made, they are often really complaining about the decision itself. Rabbi Marmer was fond of saying that for the most part, his relationship with each temple president deepened during their terms, and he was a closer friend afterwards than he had been before. This is certainly true in my case, and it was always a delight to visit with both Dov and Freja during our visits to Jerusalem over the years. Rabbi Marmer was my leader, my mentor, my rabbi, and my friend. So Elliot, we wish you a refuah shlema. We are keeping you and Judy in our prayers for healing. And finally, to bring it home tonight, the final teaching comes to us from Rabbi Michael Marmer. Rabbi Michael Marmer is a masterful teacher in his own right, but one of the reasons Holy Blossom Temple invites him to teach us here again and again is because we delight in hearing his father's wisdom shine through his own, his father's voice come through his own. Rabbi Michael Marmer made Aliyah from England in 1984. He earned a master's degree and rabbinic ordination at Hebrew University and Hebrew Union College. He became the provost of that beautiful HUC campus on King David Street and is a professor of theology there now. So among Rabbi Michael Marmer's contributions, he currently serves as the chair of the Board of Rabbis for Human Rights.
In the Mishnah, there is a discussion as to the details of blowing the shofar. And we read there the following. התוקע לתוך הבור, או לתוך הדות, או לתוך הפיתס. If you blow the shofar into a pit or a cistern or a jug, a large ceramic creation, אם כל שופר שמע, יצא. ואם כל הברה שמע, לא יצא. If the sound that you hear is the sound of the shofar itself, its direct voice, then you fulfill the obligation. But if what you heard is an echo, even by the way, if the special effects are fantastic and the sound is particularly stirring, but you're hearing not the direct sound that your ears pick up from what comes out of the shofar, but rather some kind of second order noise, then you've not fulfilled your obligation. And here comes another example of direct and indirect encounter with the voice of the shofar. מי שהיה עובר אחורי בית הכנסת, somebody who happened to be passing around the back of the Beit Knesset at the time when the shofar is being blown. Or שהיה ביתו סמוך לבית הכנסת, or a neighbor, somebody whose home is within earshot of the synagogue. ושמע כל שופר, or כל מגילה, and happened to hear the sound of the shofar, or for that matter, the sound of the Megillah being read on Purim. Im kiven libo yatsa, if the intention was to hear the shofar's voice, then okay, you can say that you've done it from the privacy of your own home. You fulfilled the mitzvah of hearing the voice of the shofar. V'im lav lo yatsa. But if the sound waves happen to reach your ears, but there was no intention behind that listening, you have not fulfilled your obligation. Af al pi shezeh shama v'zeh shama. Zeh kiven libo v'zeh lo kiven libo. Even though both heard the noise, the sound waves, the Mishnah didn't know too much about sound waves, reached their ears, the difference is a difference of intention. I bring you this teaching ahead of Rosh Hashanah from the Mishnah, an ancient normative expression of Jewish law and practice, as part of this project in which aspects of my father's teaching are being recalled. What does the Mishnah say? You actually have to be present and involved and engaged in order for the thing to have happened. And I'm reminded reading this Mishnah, if we scroll up for a moment, to a teaching in my father's lexicon, which comes to expression in a book he published some 40 years ago, Beyond Survival. He published it in London. And a theme that preoccupied him for most of his life and career. There's a chapter in that book called Vicarious Judaism. I would argue that he comes to use this term vicarious, both for some of the reasons that you'll see in a moment, his analysis of what's going on in Jewish institutional life, but also as a result of his own involvement in the psychotherapeutic community. The term vicarious fulfillment is one that's taken out of a psychologist's playbook and one that he applies in this theological context for his own purposes. Right? What's vicarious fulfillment? It's something that I don't experience at first hand, but I get the thrill, if you like, through the prism, through the awareness, through the sense, through the consciousness that another person is experiencing the thrill. Dov's book, Beyond Survival, tells you what it's about in its title itself. He is in conversation in this book with the thought of Emil Fackenheim, or at least the way that thought is commonly understood, according to which survival has become an imperative. As Emil Fackenheim himself would often point out, he never suggested that the commandment, the 614th commandment to survive, gets rid of all the other commandments. But often what my father is attacking in this book is not Fackenheim, certainly, but a certain ethos of survivalism. He writes, although the quest for survival is a fact of Jewish life, and although you can hardly be involved in that life without participating in the struggle, it doesn't mean that it's possible to accept it uncritically. Regular application of the survival formula reduces its effectiveness. Thus, even those who wish to rouse Jews with a call to survival, often warning them of the continuous danger of intermarriage and anti-Semitism, find it increasingly difficult to command the necessary response. There's a kind of a need for a more and more urgent emergency to which everybody has to respond, because survival is what's going to keep us all together. One of the most alarming effects of this exhaustion, and you might add this escalation, is the tendency to support causes and institutions in the hope that they will do the work for them. The stress on survival, he writes, has produced a kind of vicarious Judaism. Many Jews in the diaspora are subscribers rather than members, expecting organized Jewry to do the work of concerned Jews. Writing from England, he says, in the US, this has resulted in the professionalization of the Jewish world, and we can add that in the 40 years that have followed, that tendency has grown beyond the boundaries of the United States. We're seeing evidence of a growing alienation on the part of the individual Jew from his means of Jewish identity. My father is, in this book, as in much of his work, he is an equal opportunity critic. He is critical of Jewish professionals. He is critical of Jewish lay leaders. He is critical of rabbis. He's critical of members of each of the particular denominations. To be critical for my father was not to dismiss or to deny, but rather to engage with. So he writes about Jewish professionals that they have an interest in keeping the institutions that employ them going, and they often use their considerable skills to stifle every attempt to bring about change. This is part of a kind of psychological dynamic of vicarious Judaism, where lay people, often, as he writes, of a fairly low caliber, I'm amused to note this, and I'll say something about it in just a second, are in a sort of unholy alliance with lay leaders, with professional leaders in institutions. I do want to make it clear that as my father goes on now to really take issue with rabbinical leadership, he, in the course of his life, struggled to break out of the kind of phenomenon that he's criticizing here, where you have tired and cynical professionals, less than excellent lay leaders, and rabbis who've become professional apparatchiks dedicated to this task of keeping their jobs intact and enhancing their status. Wherever he could, to the best of his abilities, he looked for great rabbis with the finest lay leaders and the most dedicated professionals to break out of the kind of situation he is caricaturing in his chapter. He writes that there are Orthodox Jews who live their lives in authentic connection to their Orthodox Jewish commitments. But there are many more people who have a vicarious relationship to Orthodoxy, thinking that it will fulfill some kind of nostalgic urge that they have to do the Judaism that they imagine that their papa and mama used to have. And if you think that the non-Orthodox denominations come off any easier, you're wrong. Conservative, Reform, and Liberal Judaism have each ended up offering yet another version of vicarious Judaism. As the chapter goes on, my father speaks about diaspora relations with Israel as a prime example of this vicarious dynamic. We are looking to some Jew somewhere else to do the Jewish thing for us. It is as if, to go back to the Mishnah with which I began, we'd rather hear the echo of the shofar blast rather than the voice itself, even if that voice is, weedy and broken and not as beautiful as we might imagine it. My father's call is to step away from the tendency for vicarious Judaism and to lean into Jewish life itself. He has a thoroughgoing, comprehensive argument in his book, which we haven't got time to go in now. But the core idea that I want to bring out here is that whether it's in relation to your creed and your practice, whether it's in relation to your political agenda, whether it's in relation to social action. My father criticizes what he perceived as being, in the 1980s, a move away in reform circles from engagement with social action. Whatever it is, you need to hear the voice of the shofar directly and not to hear some distant, vicarious echo. The quest for survival, this as he says towards the very end of this chapter, in itself legitimate, noble, and necessary, has led many Jews into expecting others to do the surviving for them. The three main streams have colluded with this expectation. This Rosh Hashanah, the first one that my father won't be alive for, since it's so soon after his death, as you hear the voice of the shofar, I would encourage you to think in terms of this Marmorian category of vicarious Judaism. What do I need to do to hear the voice of the shofar itself and not some delegated, alienated, distanced version of it? On behalf of my mother, Fredja, and my sisters, my parents' grandchildren, our little family, all of us, I just want to thank your wonderful congregation for years of friendship, support, and in the wake of Dov's death, such an outpouring of love and appreciation. It's been very moving for us to hear from so many people, and this evening's activity is just another example of how appropriate the commemoration of my father's life and work has been on the part of Holy Blossom. I want to thank in particular Rabbi Splansky, whose presence during my father's final days and over the funeral was extremely significant to us. Of course, Cantor Meissner, his long-term partner, and all of the colleagues, many of whom have expressed themselves in such beautiful ways in the wake of Dad's death. A number of you have been kind enough to write and to inquire how we're all doing. My mother is grappling with the effects of a stroke that she had back in May, but she is gradually clawing back some of her verbal capacity, and every day seems to be making some improvements. She's sad, she's grief-stricken, of course, but she is a consummately resilient person and is grateful for all of the expressions of love and friendship and support which have come to her from Toronto. So thank you all, and Shana Tova, best wishes.
Psalm 61 begins, "Hear my cry, O God, heed my prayer. From the end of the earth I call to you when my heart is faint. You lead me to a rock that is high above me, for you have been my refuge, a tower of strength against the enemy. Oh, that I might dwell in your tent forever. Take refuge under your sheltering, protective wings. Selah. The ancient rabbis comment on this phrase, Agura b'olcha olamim. I will dwell in your tent forever. Usually the word we would expect to see there would be le'olam, forever. So why olamim? Why the plural, eternities? The phrase can be translated more literally to mean, I shall dwell with you, O God, in two worlds. A rabbi once asked, can one really expect to live in two worlds? When a teacher departs from this world and some of his surviving students repeat one of his teachings, at that very moment, the teacher's lips speak from the grave and say, I am living in two worlds, in the world which I left and in the world in which I am. Tonight we learned from a number of the finest teachers of the Reformed Jewish world. Each one was prompted by love and respect for their rabbi. They have brought us hints of Dov's Torah. It is comforting to drink in his wisdom again through them. There are, for each of you, gift copies of two of Rabbi Marmer's books. They're available downstairs before you leave tonight. In addition to reading his words and studying his ideas, let us devote ourselves to living by Dov's Torah. For in this way, we can increase the moments when our rabbi can live in two worlds, the one that he loved and left, and the one in which he is eternally. Cantor Benny Meisner, our cantor emeritus, was Rabbi Marmer's professional partner for 17 years. He wasn't able to reach Jerusalem in time for Dov's funeral, but he is here tonight to honor his teacher and friend by leading us in the El Malei Rachamim. Please rise.
Mordechai, here we are.
מלא רחמים, שוכן במרומים, המצא מנוחה נכונה תחת כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים טהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים, לנשמת מורנו הרב, דב בן מרדכי וציפורה, שהלך לעולמו. בגן עדן תהא מנוחתו, לכן בעל הרחמים הסתירהו בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו. אדוני הוא נחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו, ונאמר אמן.
O God, full of compassion, who dwells on high, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence to the soul of our beloved Rabbi Dov Marmer, who has entered eternity. May he be exalted among the souls of the holy and the pure, who radiate like the illuminated heavens. Merciful God, Let him find refuge in the shadow of your wings, and let his soul be bound up in the bond of life everlasting. God is his inheritance. May he rest in peace. And together we say, Amen. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah, be'alma divrach hirutei v'yamlich machotei, b'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael, ba'agala uv'izman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei rabbah mevarach le'alam u'lalmei almaya, Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yitalal shemei dekudesha b'richu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata damiran be'alma v'imru amen Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen Oseh shalom b'mromav Uyaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. V'imru. Amen. This concludes the study portion of our evening.